Hello and welcome to MIP TV, and we are with TA Made Simple. So if you're interested in transactional analysis or you're a student of transactional analysis, you may even be a practitioner of transactional analysis, this is for you because we're making TA simple. And I'm with Bob Cook, TA therapist, and we're going to be talking about maybe, arguably, the final school, the final act in the art of transactional analysis.
Yes.
And that's the relational school.
Correct. Relational transactional analysis. So here we are, 2018, 10 years ago, in 2008, a seminal, pivotal book came out, which we reviewed here in another video, in the book reviews, called Relational Transactional Analysis by Helena Hagedorn and Charlotte Sills. It became the pivotal book, which really talked about really bringing TA up to date. The idea that the relationship is key, relational transaction analysis. So this book is talking about parent, adult, child, but talking about how we are also talking with our clients in terms of a two-person psychological model where the relationship is key. So it's not leaving out parent, adult, child, but it's talking about the parent, adult, child of the therapist as well as the parent, adult, child of the client. So it's the two together in a subjective experience.
Yes, and it's interesting if you're watching this on the playlist. If you go back, we actually talk about Byrne's original model, which is very much a cognitive model, which is very much an educative model.
Correct.
Which very much didn't really discuss any kind of therapeutic relationship at all.
Not much. It talked a bit about a study of transactions where two people talk to each other in terms of, complementary ulterior adult transactions, but it never really gets explored. He talks about deconfusion the child, working the child ego state, the unconscious, but he doesn't talk about the two unconsciouses of the therapist and the client meeting in a subjective experience. So transactional analysis has really moved on into where we are now. And it was so important that sadly, I wish this hadn't happened, but the relational body, if you like, and TA community split off from the major major body itself and created its own organization called the International Association of Relational Transaction Analysis. Well, they're still part of the TA community, but they have their own body, their own conferences, and the emphasis on relationship. And that's really what I want to get home when talking about this relational school. That it's not that we are discounting TA theory, but how can we use the TA theory of parent, adult, child, games, rackets, and script within a subjective relationship? Sorry, an intersubjective relationship.
So when we were doing a book review earlier, we talked about the intrapsychic relationship, which is effectively the relationship we have with ourselves, those thoughts that kind of run blurring around in our heads. Sometimes they're helpful and sometimes they're not. And it was very much when TA started the intrapsychic, in other words, addressing the naysaying voices generated maybe from childhood or interaction with parents. But this arc is moved considerably. If I think about it moved from that very much what's the word I'm thinking about, reductionist view of the world in just a very plain intrapsychic view to the relational world is a massive leap, really, isn't it?
It's a massive leap. I mean, Byrne, I don't want to discredit Byrne in a way, because he did talk about intrapsychic things and he did talk about a study of communication, but he never really got taken up. And you are correct, 70 years later we're where we are. But if you look at Byrne's wonderful creation of transaction analysis in 1961, go back 60 years, you go to Freud. Now Freud, the godfather of psychology, talked about the isolated mind. He talked about drive theory. He talked about abstinence. He talked about neutrality. He talked about the therapist keeping out of the relationship completely with the client And even though Eric Berne didn't take up the ideas of his interpersonal communication, it wasn't grabbed up that much, it still was a big step from the isolated mind, the huge psychoanalytical emphasis of the day in the early 1902, 1920, which was all about neutrality. So it's a big step to Berne, and now we've got a further big step taking transaction analysis into the 21st century.
Yeah, and I think it's real. As someone who comes from a humanist tradition, and my training was with the work of Rogers, which is steeped in this, in the quality of the therapeutic relationship being the best outcome. The question that's kind of rattling through my head at the moment: do you think it's made TA tougher on the therapist if someone was practicing a classic Bernian way, where they were just teaching the model and helping the intrapsychic process? Because now TA therapists form a therapeutic alliance, do you think that's a harder path to tread for a therapist?
Much more challenging. As you know, I run the Manchester Institute for Psychotherapy, and I ran a weekend's training on intersubjectivity and how we work in the relationship and the sharing of yourself within a relationship. So a TA therapist now who is actually thinking in terms of relationship, building up the relationship, transference, counter-transference, how to actually work within the relationship in the service of cure, and including themselves in that process, is far more challenging than when, in the earlier days, when I believe TA therapists could hide behind the theory.
Yes, it does feel a lot more demanding. I remember reading, I've got it behind me somewhere, my very first copy of Person-Centered Counselling in Action. And it's not in the recent editions, I hasten to add. It said that person-centered therapy was perhaps the toughest therapy of all because it relied on the therapist's own self being the vehicle of therapeutic cure. And it feels that to some extent this is now the same in relational TA.
That's correct. I'm going to ask you, as you asked me a question, I'm going to ask you one.
Okay.
I meet a lot of client-centered counsellors, a lot of people who have been on many counselling courses. They come on my supervision courses and things like that. And I find a lot of them, though they are taught, perhaps not where, perhaps not in some of the very good 4 years counselling courses, on 1 year or 2 year counselors, I don't know. But they're so afraid to use their sense of self in the relationship that I often wonder to myself, are they ever encouraged to be in the relationship at all?
Well, it's an interesting question, Bob. I used to teach predominantly person-centered therapy, and congruence. Rogers put a lot of stock in congruence. In fact, in his early writings, he believed, and I think this was a reaction, as you say, to the Freudian blank slate and no connection at all. He believed that congruence and being yourself in the relationship was the most important factor.
So do you think then, in present day counselling courses, that Rogers is misrepresented or badly taught?
Well, that's a good question. I can't speak for every counselling course.
That's a big question.
This is a big question. I know that when I taught it, I was very keen on saying to my learner colleagues, you have to be yourself.
Good.
That's the biggest part of it. And if you're, if the client can see that you're human, and therefore, as what's the word I'd use, as fallible, then it automatically elicits a permission for the client to feel like that.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I give you a non-clinical example. My colleague and business partner Ken, I taught him, and I remember being the first day in class, and I have dyslexia, and mine's pretty bad.
Like me.
It's really bad. And I said, I'm going to get it straight. I used to sit there and say, right, I'm going to get it straight. I'm going to be writing words on the board, some of them that are misspelled. If you can spell them better than I can, help me out. That'd be lovely. Because, that's just the way I am, and there's very little I can do about it. You know, if I could, I would have done. And I remember him saying, and he said this on our podcast, it was just a massive relief to see someone who, you know, at that point, it's like, oh, he's a counsellor, to say, look, you know, I'm human and, you know, I can't do this. It doesn't compute, was just so powerful.
That's so wonderful, you know, refreshing to hear, because I think the question is how people are being taught then, how people are being taught congruently, how they work in the relationship probably is the question. Whether it be your framework or transaction analysis, because when I teach these people, how, you know, being in a relationship, is how they're in the relationship. The real question, I suppose.
And also framing the relationship. So what relationship are they in? And that speaks of the transference and counter-transference and also the attachment style. So are they in the therapeutic relationship, or is another relationship being replayed?
So
that's the key.
So in relational transaction analysis school, huge emphasis on the relationship. Huge emphasis on the study of transference and counter-transference. Huge emphasis on reworking the transference in the here and now. Huge emphasis on your own therapy, your own supervision, so you can be in the relationship in an authentic, transparent manner.
And just hearing this, and as we've discussed this, one of the things that really strikes me is that in this position, we're not too far apart.
No, we're not. We seriously aren't.
We're not. What kind of the difference is really on the periphery, is on the corollary. And actually, you know, we're not too far apart. And I think there's a lesson there. So if anybody's watching this and doing a comparative TA and person-centered, it might be worth just revisiting this, because my view is that, and I know you as a therapist and the therapist you taught, there's very little difference in the fact that both are intersubjective, they both develop in a relationship, Bob.
Yes, no, I'm with you. The more I go along, many of these models come together in many different ways.
Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed that. That was the Relational School of Transactional Analysis. Please have a look in the playlist, because Bob covers all aspects of TA. And I wonder what we're going to be looking at in the next.
I think what we'll look at the next one is how today we can use. I'll think about it, but I think the next step really is to talk about the style of a TA therapist. In other words, how do they choose, or how do they utilize all these different approaches, which I don't think you can. But you know what transaction analysis talks about today in terms of finding your own identity. Perhaps the identity of a transaction analyst today might be what I talk about.
And I think that's really important, because identity and developing your own identity as a therapist is just fundamental.
And as a transaction analyst as well, particularly because they're influenced by the TA heritage, from the 60s to where we are today.
Well, fascinating as always, Bob, and we'll catch up again in the next video. If you want this, go into the comments bar below. What do you think? What do you think of the development? Do you think that there is a connection, having heard this, between person-centered and TA? Let's have some comments in the comments bar. I'd love to hear from you. And as always, Bob Cook, thank you very much.
Thank you, Rory.